Good morning. Okay, today's daf is Yevamot Daf Samach Vav, and we will begin at the beginning of the seventh parak. Today we begin the seventh parak of Yevamot, and this chapter is going to discuss something we talked about a few weeks ago, namely the ability of a wife and her possessions to eat truma as a result of her marriage to a Kohen, and in particular the ramifications of when that marriage is not a valid marriage, or a marriage that is prohibited under halacha. And so in particular, for example, when a divorcee marries a Kohen, or a widow marries a Kohen Gadol. And so that's the topic. And as part of our Mishnah, we're going to differentiate between two types of property that a woman can bring into the marriage. On the one hand, she can bring in what are known as nichsei malog, and the other is nichsei ton barzel. So nichsei malog consists of property that a woman brings into a marriage, of which the husband enjoys only the fruit. So if the value goes up, she gets it. If the value goes down, she loses it. The husband gets the benefit as long as it's part of the marriage. As soon as the marriage ends, she gets the item back. It's all hers. Whatever happened to it during the course of the marriage, that's the way it goes, and that's the story. The husband has very limited rights to the underlying asset itself. On the other hand, nichsei ton barzel refers to property where the husband guarantees his wife to return the initial value of the property to her. But during the course of the marriage, he can pretty much do whatever he wants with the asset. He is simply required to return the set value at the end of the marriage, whether that's as a result of divorce or his death. And any property that a wife does not declare is specifically nichsei ton barzel, that's going to be considered nichsei malog. So everything is in the first category unless a specific statement is made putting it into the second category. So basically, when a wife brings things into the marriage, there's no guarantee that the husband is offering to the value of those property, just that he will give back that property should the marriage end. Okay, so with that background, we're now ready to take a look at the Mishnah that opens the seventh parak of Yevamot. So, Almanah Kohen Gadol. If you have a widow that is going to marry a Kohen Gadol, and so that is going to make her a halala, and it will is a prohibited marriage, and he's not allowed to do it, but it's only a lav, and so as a result, according to the majority opinion, that causes the marriage is in fact a valid marriage from a legal perspective, even though it was an improper marriage. Gerusha v'chalutza l'chohen hedyot, or if you have a divorcee or a chalutza, somebody who did chalitza with the surviving brother, when a brother died without children, as we've seen throughout Maseches Yevamos, which is dealt primarily with that situation. If any of them marry a regular Kohen, lo avdei milog v'avdei ton barzel. Now let's say she brings some servants with her. She brings some slaves that have been considered part of nichsei malog, and she's included some that are nichsei ton barzel. So what happens to the two types of slaves? So avdei malog lo yochlu b'truma. The malog slaves are not allowed to eat truma. Avdei ton barzel yochelu. But the ones that are ton barzel, which again, ton barzel is like iron. And so it's ton is sheep and iron is barzel, right? So the idea is that they are very solid. The money is guaranteed back to the wife, whether it goes up or down. She gets exactly what she came in with, nothing more, nothing less. And so that puts additional burden on him, and that those slaves may eat truma. So again, this same malog slaves, where he only gets the benefit from the slaves, but not their actual value. That those slaves cannot eat truma, but the Nixei Tzon Barzel slaves are allowed to eat truma. And now the Gemara is going to explain all or some of the key rules in connection with Nixei Malog slaves, and then with respect to Nixei Tzon Barzel slaves, thereby providing further explanation of the Mishnah, of the statement that we just made. And these are the rules that apply to of the Malog slaves that are Malog slaves. If they die, Mesula, right? The death is hers, meaning that she bears the loss associated with that death. And if they go up in value, Hosirula, the value goes to her. And even though it turns out that he's responsible for feeding them because he gets the benefit of their work during their marriage, they're not allowed to eat truma. And these are the rules with respect to the Tzon Barzel slaves. Right? If they die, it's his responsibility to cover the loss associated with that death. Because they're Tzon Barzel, he's guaranteed to return to her. If the slave was worth $100 when they came into the marriage, so then he guarantees her the $100, whatever happens. So if the slave dies, he needs to give her $100 to replace the slave if they then get divorced or when he dies, when the husband dies. Beim hosiru, and if they go up in value, hosiru low. So now the slave, instead of being worth $100, is worth $1,000. So that benefit goes to the husband. He gets to enjoy that. All he has to give to her is the $100 that the slave was worth when he came into the marriage, when the slave came into the marriage. And since he's responsible for every aspect of the value, so they're allowed to eat truma because it's considered as if it's his property. Now let's talk about the Mishnah turns to regular rules. So Bas Yisrael Shenisus L'Kohen, not a improper marriage, but a regular marriage where you have a daughter of a Yisrael who marries a Kohen, and she brings into the marriage certain slaves that she owns. They're allowed to eat truma, even the ones that are Nixei Malog, because of course she is also allowed to eat truma. As a reminder, right, in the first case where the widow or marries a Kohen Gadol, or a divorcee or chalutza marries a regular Kohen, they are not allowed to eat truma because they are considered a halala. They're not a kosher for eating truma any longer. And so as a result, since they are not allowed to eat truma, their possessions are also not allowed to eat truma. Whereas when the daughter of Yisrael marries a Kohen, she is allowed to eat truma. And so as a result, the slaves are also allowed. Both categories of slaves are allowed to eat truma. Uvas Kohen shenisas Yisrael. What about if a Kohen marries a Jew, a regular Yisrael? So Nisa lo avadim, and she brings slaves with her. Bain of the Malog, Bain of the Tzon Barzel, Halrei Elu lo yoch. They're not allowed to eat truma because they're part of the husband's family. They're no longer connected to her father's family, and so as a result, they are not allowed to eat truma. So that is our Mishnah. We now turn to the Gemara, and the Gemara is going to provide a source for what we've said of how we know that a Kohen. First, let's start with how we know that a Kohen's property is allowed to eat truma, and then we'll explain, and then we'll ask a question to try and understand why it is that the Nechsei Malog slave, when a divorcee brings it to her Kohen husband, or a widow brings it to her Kohen Gadol husband, why they are not allowed to eat, because one might have thought that they should be allowed to eat. So let's take a look at it inside. Again, we said that the of the Malog are not able to eat truma. Amai, why should that be the case? Lehevi b'kinyano shekana kinyan. It should be considered part of the category of a Kohen's property that buys other property. And so let's see, because we have a brisa that explains the rationale, explains the source for the fact that Kohen's property and the Kohen's property that buys property are all able to eat truma. The Tanya minayin leKohen shenasa isha. How do we know that a Kohen who marries a woman, v'kana avadim, and through that gets slaves, rather he buys slaves. So again, he takes a woman as his wife, which is an acquisition, which is one type of acquisition, or he purchases slaves. In both cases, the person who was effectively acquired is allowed to eat truma, because it says shenemar b'choen ki yiknen nefesh kinyan kaspo hu yochalbo. Right. So when the Kohen acquires a person, well, that refers to whether it's an acquisition of a marriage or an acquisition of a slave. In both cases, yochalbo, that the person is allowed to eat from the truma. Uminayin leisha shekansa avadim va'avadav shekanu avadim. Well, what about a wife that purchases slaves, or a slave that purchases slaves? Sheyochlu b'truma. How do I know that they also are allowed to eat truma? Now, you probably are asking yourself, I don't understand. How could you have a slave buy anything? A slave doesn't have any property. Well, that's Tosfos and Rashi both asked that question. So take a look. We'll take a look in Rashi first, right opposite the Hagos Habach on the middle of the narrow lines in Rashi. Now, how is this? What is this case of slaves who buy other slaves? So the Garsina, that's the right girsa. The im tomar mashikana aved kana rabo. Don't we have a general principle that anything that a slave owns, the master owns? So therefore, lamai itzrich kra. Why do I need any verse in order to tell us this rule? It's obvious. It's so clear, because the slave can't really own anything himself. So mishkakasla, no, it's not actually true. We can find a situation where a slave can own something separate from the owner. So, for example, if somebody outside the relationship of the slave and his master were to give the slave $100, let's say, and say that I am not, that your master has no rights in this, that they're not allowed to enjoy any aspect of this money. Well, in that situation, the slave would be able to have that possession and thereby have money that he could use to acquire another slave. Tosfos builds on this, because the problem is that Rashi has provided one viewpoint in a Gemara that we will see eventually in Kedushin. Because in Kedushin, there's another viewpoint, and Tosfos picks up with that other viewpoint. So Afilu Rabbi Meir, the Amar Ein Kinyan LaEved, that below Rabbo, Afilu Almanas Sheyatza Bo Lecherus, and even in a situation where he's going to go free, there is, according to Rabbi Meir, does not work. So mishkachas lol avadim kanu avadim b'mafkir avdo. That we can find a situation where a slave buys another slave, where the master, and specifically a Kohen who is the master, makes his slave hefker. So although the slave himself effectively no longer is no longer a possession of the Kohen, he's still not free. And as a result, the Okul Betruma, we're going to see that Kedamrina Beparak Basra decreases, that in the last parak of Krisus, we're going to see that such a slave who is made ownerless is allowed to still eat truma. So although he's he's allowed to still eat truma, and he's no longer, whatever he acquires is no longer attributable to the original owner. At the same time, he is still connected to that original owner who was a Kohen, who made him hefker in a way that effectively allows him to eat truma. So now we have that slave, that other slave, that the first slave purchases, will also be able to eat truma. And now, what's the source of that? So we go back into the Gemara. Shneamar, the source of it is the same verse that we cited a moment ago. V'choen ki yikne nefesh kinyan kasbohu yochal bo. So that whatever he's whatever a Kohen acquires in terms of people, so it is the acquisition of his money, and he can eat from it. Well, that's a very funny kind of turn of phrase. So kinyan kasbo, the implication is that who's the antecedent or the actor in this verse is in some ways unclear, because one can read it as the Kohen with respect to a Kohen. Ki yikna nefesh kinyan kasbo, when his monetary acquisition does an acquisition of a soul, so then hu yochal bo, then he's allowed to eat of it. So kinyan shekana kinyan ochel, that the implication is that when a Kohen's property acquires other property, that property is allowed to eat. So now the question is, if given all this, given this brisa, why is it that when the wife is a halala and she brings in the nichsei malog slaves, why is it that they're not allowed to eat truma? She is his property. She, on some level, she then acquires the slave, and so it's effectively covered by the verse. So the Gemara explains, and the Gemara is going to offer three different answers to this question. Answer number one: Kol ha'ochel ma'achil, kol she'ein ochel eino ma'achil. No, the only one who can enable the secondary transaction to result in somebody eating truma is only if the first person's able to eat. So when a regular wife who is able to eat truma buys a slave, doesn't make a difference what kind of slave she is, with a slave, what kind of slave the slave is allowed to eat truma because the wife is allowed to eat truma. But when the wife is a halala, if she's bringing in, unless it's something that we're going to consider his property, like nichsei tzom barzel, when it comes to nichsei malog, so no, we're not going to consider that his property, and as a result, that slave is not going to be able to eat truma. But below, is that really true that they can't eat truma? What about an uncircumcised kohen or a tamei kohen? They are not allowed to eat truma, but if they buy something or marry somebody, that they're allowed to eat truma. So that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't seem like your statement is true that only somebody who cannot eat, only somebody who can eat truma can cause somebody else to eat truma. These are kohanim who can eat truma, but they can cause somebody to eat truma. So hastam pumayu kayiflu. That's like they had a pain in their mouth, meaning it's not something fundamentally wrong with the kohen. It's something that's fixable in the kohen. Uncircumcised kohen could get circumcised. The tamei kohen could go through the tahara process and become tahor, and so then they'll be able to eat truma. So it is not considered. So that's not really a fair comparison, and so as a result, that is not a problem. And so we're back to the answer of kol ha'ochel machil, kol she'ein ochel eino machil. Anybody who can eat can enable somebody to eat, and somebody who can't eat is not able to enable to eat. Well, in second, mamzer she'ein ochel machil. We're going to see the following case. Rashi goes through this in detail, but we'll see it outside now. We're going to see in a few days the following case. What happens if a woman marries a kohen and they have a daughter? That daughter marries a mamzer and they have a child, and that child is male. So now the kohen husband dies, the daughter who married the mamzer dies, and all that is left is the grandchild of now the widow, who is a mamzer, because the child of a mamzer is a mamzer, and so this mamzer is going to enable his grandmother to continue to eat truma, because one of the categories, if in fact she were to have no descendants from her husband, then she goes back to her father's house, and since she is a Bas Yisrael, we'll assume she won't be allowed to eat truma. But if she has a descendant, even if that descendant is a mamzer, we're going to allow her, because that descendant comes from her husband, the Kohen, and even though that descendant is not a Kohen, we're going to allow her to continue to eat truma from her husband's estate. And so that is a case where the grandson is not allowed to eat truma. And of course, that would also be true even if the grandson wasn't the mamzer. If the husband of the daughter was just a Yisrael, everything else in this case would be the same. It just so happens that the case that we will talk about in a few days deals where the son-in-law is a mamzer. But in any event, the point is that this widow is going to be allowed to eat truma, even though the person who is effectively enabling her to eat truma is not allowed to eat truma. So we see that your principle, the answer number one that we were trying to give of kol ha'ochel machel kol she'ein ochel eino machel is not true. Here we have somebody who is ein ochel, namely the grandson, but he is machel. He does cause somebody else to eat. So Amar Ravina explains that is not a good comparison. Kinyan ochel komer. No, when we were talking about kol ochel machil and kol she'eno ochel eno machil, we're talking about where the person who is the first person is doing an acquisition, and that acquisition is what's enabling the person to eat or not to eat. So in our case, in the case we just talked about the mamzer grandson, that isn't an acquisition. That's just his existence. Here, though, we're talking about a kinyan. And when it comes to kinyan ochel machel, a kinyan of somebody who can eat enables somebody else to eat. She'eno ochel eno machel. But when it comes to a kinyan of somebody who's not able to eat, is not going to enable someone else to eat. So that is the first explanation. So that's explanation number one. And according to this explanation, so then this is in fact on some level a biblical status, and that in fact from a biblical perspective, the wife's slaves are not allowed to eat the truma. But Rava and Rav Ashi are going to offer two alternative explanations. The Rava Amar Midoraisa Meichel Achli. Really, according to the Torah, this Nichse Mulog slave is allowed to eat truma. The Rabbanan who de Gazrig Bahu, and it's the rabbis who made a gzeira to prohibit that slave to eat truma, because they because the widow might end up saying, I can't eat truma. So we want the widow to say, look, I'm not allowed to eat truma. My slaves are not allowed to eat truma. Zona hietzlo. It's like she, namely I, it's like I'm a zona. I'm just like a harlot to my husband. I'm not a real wife. And Hilkoch asula puke. And so as a result, hopefully, because we want them to divorce because they're not supposed to be married in the first place, as a result of this effective mistreatment of her, of this lower class treatment of her, she will feel like having a desire to be divorced. Rav Ashi offers a third explanation. Maybe he doesn't feel like that's such a great addition. Obviously, her own ability to eat truma makes her feel like a harlot, but maybe having the slave be able to eat truma doesn't really affect her. So Rav Ashi offers a third explanation. Rav Ashi Amar Gzeira Shematachil La'achar Misa. No, the concern that we have is that maybe she will allow the slave to continue eating truma even after the husband dies. The issue is as follows. She's not allowed to eat truma because she's a halal. So, and she's of course not allowed to eat truma even after the husband's death. So nothing changes for her. So maybe she'll assume that there will be no change for the status of her slaves. Her slaves, when before her husband died, were allowed to eat truma, and now maybe even after her husband dies, they'll also be allowed to eat truma. So Elamiata Bas Yisrael Shenisus Lekohen Lo Tachel. Well, why should we let the daughter of a Yisrael who's allowed to eat truma why don't we say the same thing with respect to her Malog slaves? Maybe they'll come to allow them to eat. So Ella Ella Amaravashi, the Almahna Kohenes. No, the issue is not with respect to a regular Yisrael, but with respect to a daughter of a Kohen who is a widow, the Asya, and then marries a Kohen Gadol, presumably, because that's why she's a Halala. The Asya La'uriye, that or she could be already a divorcee, and now her husband has died. The Asya La'uriye, right? She might come to use as a justification the following logic: Mikara achle betruma debei nasha. That when I was in my father's house, I was able to eat truma. Inasve le lahai achle betruma de gavrai, and my specifically my slaves ate truma. Inasve le lahai achle betruma de gavrai. And when I married my husband, so then they continued to eat truma. Vahashta, hadri li, lemilse kamaisa. And now that I am a widow, I should go back to my original status, that namely my slaves should be able to eat truma. So even if I am now a halala and cannot eat truma, presumably they should be able to go back because I'm the daughter of a Kohen, and they were able to eat truma before I married the person the Kohen that I'm not allowed to marry. They should be able to eat truma again. And she won't realize that the reason that before she went into the marriage, she was allowed the slaves were allowed to eat truma. It's because she was not a halala. Rather, they were able to eat her father's truma because she was also able to eat truma. Hasha shavisa nafsha halala. But now she has become a halala, and so she's not allowed to eat truma. So when she goes back to her father's house, she's not allowed to eat truma, and her slaves are not allowed to eat truma. And so even though when she was if we allow her to feed her slaves truma in her father's house, we'll assume that when she goes back, if we allow her to feed her slaves truma when she's in her husband's house, even though that husband was a husband she was not allowed to marry and made her a halala, if we allow her to do that, she might think she's still allowed to eat truma, feed them truma when she goes back to her father's house, even after becoming a halala, and that's not true. So Teinach Amana Kohenes. Well, all right. So that explains why you would make a gzeira to not allow a daughter of a Kohen who marries somebody she's not allowed to marry to feed her slaves truma during the life of the husband who's a Kohen. But Almana Bas Yisrael, when you have the halala being the daughter of a Yisrael, why would she think the same thing? She won't think that. From her perspective, what will she think? She'll realize that, listen, I am a halala, and I never was allowed to eat truma. And the only reason that my slaves became allowed to eat truma is because I married the Kohen. Now that the Kohen died, presumably I go back to my original status. My original status was that my slaves and I were not allowed to eat truma. So, of course, I was never allowed to eat truma because I was a halala, but my slaves will now go back to the original status and not be able to eat truma. So why can't we allow the daughter of a Yisrael who brings slaves, a nichsei malog slaves, into the marriage with an illegal Kohen, why don't we allow those slaves to eat truma? So ba'almanusa lo pligi rabbanan. No, there's a concept of lo plug that once we make a rule, we're going to apply it across the board. And so too here, we're making a rule. We may have made the rule based on the daughter of a Kohen, but will apply the rule irrespective of what the Halala's ancestry is. So now we've given the three reasons, and we can now turn to the question of the understanding Nichse Tzon Barzel and some of the issues that relate to it. So Itmar, Hamachneses Shum Levala, that if a woman brings into the marriage evaluated shum is an evaluation levala to her husband. So property that has been evaluated is another way of saying nichse tzon barzel. So she brings in, and because obviously you have to evaluate the property to understand what that value is that the husband is guaranteeing it. So he omeres kelayani tell us. She now unfortunately the marriage has ended and in divorce, and she says to her husband, I brought in these candlesticks as nichse tzon barzel. So you guaranteed that whatever would happen to them, you'd give me back their value of $1,000, and I want to take these vessels back. V'hu amar damimani notain. No, I'm going to give you money. I have developed a connection with these, and I want to give you the money, and I want to keep the property. No change in value to the property in this case. Just the husband and wife, who obviously they're getting divorced. It's not so surprising that they might argue about everything. So hadinim mi, who's right in this case? So Rav Yehuda says, as we turn to Samach Vav and Bet, hadinima, really she's the right one. The Rebbe Amar, no, hadinimo. The Rebbe of Rabbi Ami says, no, the halacha is like with the husband, all he's committed to is giving back the value. So now let's explain both the opinions. Rav Yehuda Amar hadinima mishum shevach beis avia didahabi. Because the point is that obviously she brought this into the marriage. So as a result, it has some kind of connection to her father's house. And that value associated with it being from her father's house, that should belong to her. So we should allow her to take the object. Rabbi Ami Amar hadini mo, kaven de Amar mar, im mesu mesu lo, v'im hosiru hosiru lo, ho v'chayabach riyusan yochelu. When it came to our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah said when it came to nichse tzon barzel, what is the law? If it dies, that he has to cover it. If it increases in value, it goes to him. And because he is obligated in taking responsibility for them, he has to feed them. So the implication is that it's as if he owns them. So as a result, if he actually owns the object, well, then he can decide whether he gives the woman back money or the object. So Amar of Safra, mi katani dehain shalo. 1 second. So one might have thought that this is a terrific proof that Rav Ami brings against Rabbi Yehuda. But our Gemara now shows that this is not a perfect proof, and actually Rabbi Yehuda's position is totally consistent with our Mishnah. Because did our Mishnah say dehain shalo, that the slaves are his? It did not. Right? Meaning the Mishnah could have said that since he is responsible for the loss and he gets the gain, hein shalo, it's as if they were his. But it doesn't say that. It's that they're his. It doesn't say that. It says katani. It says that he's liable for them. So the la'olam lavdi deininu. They're not in fact his. Okay. So now we've got Rav Yehuda's explanation of our Mishnah, and that sort of makes a lot of sense. So now what would Rav Ami say back to that? Because now he needs to explain, well, why doesn't our Mishnah say that the nichse tzon barzel are the property of the husband? Doesn't the closer read of our Mishnah actually show that Rabbi Yehuda is right, that the nichse tzon barzel are not in fact his property, meaning that they remain the wife's property. One second, is it really true that any slave that a Kohen is responsible can eat truma? Meaning, you want to say that what's going on here, you, Rav Yehuda, and the people who are in your camp want to say that what's going on here is all about responsibility and not ownership. And responsibility is enough to cause us to say that the Kohen's allowed, the Kohen is allowed to feed truma to the slave, but at the same time, the Kohen does not get to hold on to the slave if the wife wants it back. But it's not true that responsibility is sufficient to allow the feeding of truma to an object, because we have the following Mishnah that we're going to learn in Maseches that is in Maseches Trumos. V'hatanan Yisrael shesachar paramikohen. If a non-Kohen rents a cow from a Kohen, harezeh yachilena karshine truma. It is allowed to eat animal feed that is truma. And Kohen shesachar param Yisrael aval pishim izonoseha alav. And on the other hand, a Kohen who rents a cow from a Yisrael, even though the Kohen is obligated to feed that cow, lo yachilena karshine truma, he is not allowed to feed that cow animal feed of truma. And the reason, and so we see that there is not a direct connection between level of responsibility and the ability to feed truma. And so now, and so as a result, when we say in our Mishnah that the Kohen is liable for the loss and gets the benefit of the increase, what we're actually saying is that it's effectively some kind of ownership. And so because just responsibility is not enough to result in feeding of truma. But the Gemara asked the Sisbra, 1 second, you really haven't compared comparable cases. Because although a renter is liable for theft or loss, be'on seha, in the case of an unavoidable loss, so or when the animal becomes weakened, or if it loses value during the course of the rental, mi mechayev, is the renter obligated for that loss in value? The answer is no. And so as a result, this case is not comparable to the case of Nechsei Tzon Barzel, because Nechsei Tzon Barzel has a full level of responsibility. And renting does not have a full level of responsibility. So halo damya el l'seifa. So really, the case that we have is really comparable to the very end of that Mishnah that we cited in Trumos. That what does that Mishnah conclude with? Yisrael shesham paramikohen. If a Yisrael evaluates a cow when renting it and guarantees that value to the renting Kohen, well, then in that case, lo yachilena karshine truma. That Yisrael is not allowed to feed animal feed of truma to the animal. On the other hand, aval Kohen shesham para mi Yisrael yochilena karshine truma. He is allowed to feed animal feed of truma. The Kohen who does the renting and does the evaluation and does the guaranteeing is allowed to. So we see that full responsibility is equal to ability to feed Kohen. And you don't have to say that it's actually the person's property. And so as a result, we now are back to the debate. And so we have Rav Yehuda on the one hand, who effectively says full responsibility does not grant ownership, and therefore it belongs to the wife, and the wife can take it back if it exists at the end of the marriage. And Rabbi Ami, who says no, in fact, full responsibility is essentially equivalent to ownership, and therefore the husband, if he wants, can give only money back and does not have to return the object. So Yosef, Rabba, Rav Yosef, Bishil, Birkei, the Rav Nachman. So Rabba and Rav Yosef were sitting at the end of a lecture that Rav Nachman gave. The Yasvi Ka'amre, and they were talking. And they were sitting and talking. Tanya Kavase de Rav Yehuda. And a brisa was taught in connection with Rav Yehuda. The Tanya Kavasi to Rabbi Ami, and another brisa was taught in accordance with Rabbi Ami. So we see that there are two trains of thought, that one consistent with Rabbi Yehuda and one consistent with Rabbi Ami. What's the one? Tanya Kavasi to Rabbi Ami. The one that was consistent with Rabbi Ami is the following: of the Tzon Barzel, you have the slaves of Tzon Barzel, Yotzin B'Shein V'Ayin L'Ish Abalo L'Isha. That if the husband knocks out a tooth, he's considered like the owner, and so as a result, if he knocks out the tooth, the slave goes free. And if the wife knocks out the tooth, she's not the owner, so as a result, the slave does not go free. And so as that shows that Rabbi Ami must be correct, because we're treating the slave as actual property of the owner, of the husband. Tanya Kavasi to Rabbi Yehuda. What about the teaching that is consistent with Rabbi Yehuda that suggests that it's not actually the property of the husband? If a woman brings some evaluated property, namely that means it's nichsei tzon barzel, into the marriage for her husband, the im ratza habal limkor lo yimkor. If the husband wants to sell it, he's not allowed to sell it. The lo owed, not only is he not allowed to sell it, even if the husband has his own property that he brings in, to the marriage, and he gives to his wife, and with the concept that he would be able to take out that value, imratza habal limkor lo yimkor. He's not allowed to sell that either. So the point is, of course, the first part is the key point for us, and that is that that we see that nichsei tzon barzel is not his property because he's not allowed to sell it. And in fact, the brisa continues, machru shneyem lefarnasa. If either of them sell it in order to get money so that they can live, zehaya ma'isa lifnei Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. This was something that happened in front of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. But Amar habal motzi miyad al-kokos. The husband's allowed to take the property back from whoever purchases it, because it's not actually his property to have sold in the first place. So now we've got two traditions. So how do we paskin? So Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman, halakha Rav Yehuda. So Rava says in the name of Rav Nachman that the halakha is like Rav Yehuda. So Amar le Rava le Rav Nachman, Vatanya kavase to Rabbi Ami. 1 second, we have a teaching that. So again, Rava tells us that Rav Nachman said that the halakha was like Rav Yehuda, and obviously, as part of that discussion, Rava asked Rav Nachman, "What about the brisa that is according to Rabbi Ami?" So Afagav the Tanya Kavasi to Rabbi Ami, Mistabra Tama to Rabbi Yehuda, Mishum Shavak Beis Aviyah. That even though we also have a brisa according to Rabbi Ami, of course, we do have a brisa according to Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Yehuda's position makes more sense because, in fact, the property had some connection with her father's house, and that provides some value. And there is what's a thing called sentimental value. So this is really highlighting the existence of that concept in halacha. So so now we're going to get a case where, in fact, this seems to be a problem, because there was a case that seems to show that Rava himself did not say that the property goes to the woman. So the So there was a woman who brought for her husband a nice cloak as a dowry. They had a nice coat. Shachiv. Unfortunately, the husband died. Shakluha yasme ufarsua amisna. The orphans, the children of the husband, took the coat and spread it over the corpse. And now, of course, the wife wants it back. The problem is that when you use something for a deceased, that property that goes on a deceased is no longer allowed to be benefited from. So do we say that they're not allowed to do that to property that they don't own? Or do we say that no, it's not, it's even though the wife has a claim to it, it isn't her property completely. So Amarava cannot kanya the mista. That actually will say that the dead body, the corpse, has acquired the garment, meaning that that we're not allowed to use the garment for anything else. So she doesn't get it. So doesn't that seem to be inconsistent? So Amar Le, Nanai, Brei de Rav Yosef, Brei de Rava, the Rav Kahana, V'ha'amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman, Halacha, Rav Yehuda. Isn't this inconsistent with saying that the halacha is like Rav Yehuda? Doesn't Rav Yehuda say that the property remains the property of the wife? So Amar Le, Mi lo moda Rav Yehuda de mechusar govainu govainu. That no, Rav Yehuda understands that actually ownership is a much more complicated concept. It does not that there are aspects of ownership that are not complete, and when the wife does not actually have the object in her possession, it is something that lacks grabbing. It lacks being in her hand. The kaven de mechusar gavaina, and since it is not actually in her physical possession, birushu seikai, it is considered in the husband's possession. It's not his property, but it is in his possession. It's not 100% his property, but it is in his possession. And Rava l'taimei, and Rava follows his reasoning, because we saw this earlier, I believe, even in this Maseches, the concept of Da'amar Rava, hektish chametz, and now we turn to the top of Samazayan Amud Aleph, the shechrur mafkin midei shibud, that we have this concept that if somebody has property that is owed to somebody else, so I borrow or I borrow money and I give you a lien on my computer, and then I consecrate my computer, or I give you a lien on some chametz that I own, and then it becomes Pesach. Those things, or I give you a lien on a slave that I own, and I give you, a specifically, a particularly kind of strong kind of lien, that this is the property, what's known as an apoteke, that you're allowed to claim this item. So, but then either I consecrate the item, or if the item is chametz and it becomes Pesach, so as a result, we're not allowed to benefit from it, or I free the slave that I gave as the apoteke. In all those cases, the lien that you have gets eliminated, and so as a result, that is consistent with the concept here, that effectively the usage of this coat as a shroud has taken it from something that has a lien on it to something that no longer has that lien, and is actually now considered property of the deceased, of the that is dedicated for the burial. So finally, we'll conclude with the last piece before our Mishnah. Amar Rav Yehuda, a very consistent teaching for Rav Yehuda. Hechnizalo shnei chelim be'elav zuz. If the wife brings in 2 vessels that are worth 1,000 zuz total, we'll assume that they're, just for simplicity the sake, the Gemara effectively assumes that they're each worth 500. And now they're getting divorced, and it's worth 2,000. Echad notalto b'ksubasa. She can take, and now we'll assume each of them is worth 1,000. She can take one of them as her ksuba. The echad nosenes damin b'notalto, and then the other one she can pay money for and pay another 1,000 and get that as well. Because again, we allow her to benefit. We recognize the sentimental value associated with the property, and we enable her to take that property. So my kamash malan, isn't this obvious? We already know that Rabbi Yehuda gives value to sentimental property. We know already that it's sentimental property. Ha'amra Rabbi Yehuda chadazimna. We already taught it. So ma'odatema, no. I might have thought that the cases are different. Hani mili hecha dematcha lemishkal b'ksubasa. In a case where the value has not changed, and so as a result, she's taking it's just that she's getting her ksuba. She's getting what was committed to in the ksuba, namely to give back the value of the property that she brought into the wedding, to the marriage. So, about mesan damei umishkal lo, but to actually add money and give and then take the vessels, meaning that beyond what's committed in the ksuba, I might have thought that that is not allowed. So Kamash Malan, Rabbi Yehuda now teaches that in fact it is allowed. And so tomorrow we'll stay tuned, because we're going to talk about a daughter of a Yisrael who marries a Kohen, gets pregnant, and then the Kohen dies. So what impact does the descendant of a Kohen in her womb have on the ability of her slaves to eat truma? So stay tuned tomorrow as we will discuss the answer. All right. Have a wonderful day. Thanks so much.